Welcome to my next episode, but this is not a Great War story, this is a World War II story. Now I don't know if anybody's actually looked at my description of my channel, but right at the beginning I wrote that this was going to be about my World War I and World War II research into different family members. Now I've made 30 episodes so far, completely focused on World War I. This is going to be my first World War II one, and it focuses in particular on my uncle, my mother's brother. His name was Alexander John Fowler. He was RNZAF, Royal New Zealand Air Force, but ultimately RAF in World War II. Now the opening picture of this is very special to me indeed, because I commissioned this painting. For a long time I was thinking that I would like to get a painting made, something about one aspect of my family story. Perhaps something about my grandfather who was shot through the face in World War I, perhaps something about William Francis, my grandmother's brother who died on March 23rd, 1918, or perhaps something about my uncle who died in World War II. And in the end I settled on my uncle, and I really could have chosen a very dramatic scene of these mosquitoes attacking a German train and being shot out of the sky, but I thought I really don't want a picture of my uncle dying. Instead I chose that day, but the morning of that day, the last time they would ever take off, and none of these 5 planes would return. And that was the point, to make it something a bit more than just something about my uncle. So we have my uncle as the navigator in a Mosquito, being the last one to climb on, and I described to the artist I'd like to have him sort of looking out at the world, because this was going to be his last time, because that plane would be shot down. But this was a disastrous day for 487 Squadron. During Operation Clarion, you can see it written at the top, they flew out of an air base in France, Rosiers-en-Sentier, on the 22nd of February 1945, and they lost 5 Mosquitoes. The 2 Mosquitoes that are on the ground were shot down in close proximity, and the 4 men were all buried in the same local village cemetery. The next 2 planes in sequence taking off were shot down and their crews were killed, and the final one, the larger one in the sky immediately above my uncle's plane, that one would be shot down, but at least the crew would manage to bail out, and they would be taken prisoner and spend the rest of the war in a German prisoner of war camp. Now, the artist who I commissioned this painting from was David Pentland. I sort of looked around online and I can't quite remember why I contacted him, but he was excellent. I looked at a lot of his samples. You can see a lot of what he does is tanks and ground stuff, but I also looked at his planes and seemed to produce pretty good stuff. And I contacted him and he was great. I mean, we talked about what I wanted. He gave me a good upfront quote. He gave me these sketch drawings, 5 initially, to say which one of these do you like, and then based on that we renegotiated a little bit more what I'd like it to look like. He sent me 3 back, we settled on a final design, the one that you see, and then he produced it, and then, well, he lives in Northern Ireland and I live in Southern California. He mailed it to me in this incredibly secure, well-packaged crate that he built himself, and I have to say, if you were thinking about getting commissioning a painting of any scene, military art, he'd be your man. And if you happen to like the look of the painting of my uncle in 487 Squadron, then he has copies for sale as well. So there he is, and I highly recommend him. And here are a few close-ups of different scenes of the different planes taking off. It was actually quite tricky because I really wanted to get, the actual numbers of the planes, the code numbers, and to try to squeeze all of those elements in. There was really only one piece of artistic license that we used, that it was apparently rather overcast and gloomy and hard to see much of the sky, and that would have interfered with the beauty of the painting. So we did alter the weather a little bit just with artistic license, but aside from that, this was about as accurate as we could get it and still have all of the elements in the painting that I wanted to get. Now, who was my uncle? Well, his final rank when he died was Flight Lieutenant. Flight Lieutenant Alexander John Fowler. That was his New Zealand service number. And the combat squadrons he served with were 214 Squadron and 161 Squadron in which he was a navigator in one of these short Stirlings. That's the big bomber up on the top right. 214 Squadron was a mainline bomber squadron. 161 Squadron was attached to SOE, the Special Operations Executive supplying the French resistance. And then, after a stint as a trainer, he then joined 487 Squadron with Mosquitoes, and it was, well, while serving with that squadron that he died. Now, to bring it back to the family history, that picture on the left I've shown you before in some previous episodes shows my grandfather, who is, well, as a father, and I've talked a little bit about him and a little bit about him meeting his wife, my grandmother, in London. They were married on January the 1st, 1919, and I've made an episode, I think I called it After the War, Then What?, talking about their life and what they did. And I've quoted from a family history written by Uncle Duncan, that's the eldest boy. My mother wasn't born when this photo was taken. She was one of those last-minute surprises. So she was about 10 years younger than the youngest boy in this family photo. And that's, well, part of the reason why, unusually, I can talk about both my grandfathers being veterans of World War I. I haven't yet talked about my paternal grandfather. Everything mostly up to date has been about my New Zealand grandfather you see in the photo, but I'm working on an episode right now. It's going to be a big one that may tangentially include my paternal grandfather. If you like that massacre episode, and it's up to 4.2 thousand views so far, I think you're going to like the next one I'm working on, but it's getting bigger and bigger. I think I'm going to have to split it into two parts. It's going to be a really detailed breakdown of a battle with accounts from the Germans and the British on both sides, lots of eyewitness accounts of the German breakthrough on the Crozat Canal, and, well, anyway, I think you're going to enjoy it. But in the meantime, I'm giving you this World War II one, and it's the second boy. That's Alexander John, Alec, as they called him, who I've put the red circle around. Well, you don't think of him as being a veteran when you see a family photo when they're younger, but of course, boys grow up, and he grew up and went to war. Now, this photo up here, the family didn't know this one existed. We got that from the UK National Archives, and this was the graduation photo of one of their training courses in England, and I managed to find the one. It was the 69th course, and there he is smack bang in the middle. Interestingly enough, the crew that he ended up flying that short Stirling with are also included in the circle. The man just in front of him, who's sitting down with a quite stern expression, was the Australian Sylvester Eddy, who would be the pilot of his bomber, and the guy behind was Needham. I think he was he the engineer, or... Anyway, he was one of the other crew, and a couple of the gunners are also elsewhere in that photo, and future episodes I'm going to come back and deal with a lot of these in more detail. And the photo down the bottom right is a family photo, and I think it must have been taken not long before he went off to war, because he was pretty young when he went, and my mother does at least feature in this photo, and you can see in the bottom photo the massive scar that my grandfather got when he was shot through the face. And if you compare that to the family photo at the top left, you can see they airbrushed it out. He had this massive scar, but it's completely invisible in that group family photo. And so my mother at least has been born, and you can see that my youngest uncle, who was the littlest boy in both photos, you can see on that expression that he was a bit of a lad, a bit of a naughty fellow, and, well, yes, he was. That really did match his character, shall we say. But that's Uncle Alec in the back row. Where my Uncle Duncan, the eldest one, was, I'm not sure. He may very well have already gone to war, because he went earlier than Uncle Alec did. And I visited his graveyard, the graveyard where his body now rests, in Germany, near Soltau in the north, sort of near Hamburg, more or less. And that's his gravestone that I'm touching right there. And he was listed as missing for 18 months. They didn't know what had happened to his body. Well, that obviously happened to a lot of the air crew who were shot down, especially if their bodies were badly mangled. The Germans weren't able to ID them. They did try. And there was an organisation called the Missing Research and Inquiry Service, whose job it was to go out and try to hunt down these bodies, these graves, and try to work out who they were, using the clues. The German reports might say, well, this plane was shot down in this location on such and such a day, and then they'd have a list of, 4 or 5 planes that it could have been, and they'd go and look for clues. And they dug up his body in December of 1946. Remember, he died in February of 45. And he was originally buried in the Bevan Village Cemetery near where he was shot down. Later, and this was pretty common in World War I and World War II, there was a big concentration of the war dead, and they were dug up and their bodies were reburied in military cemeteries where they could be properly cared for. So the gravestone that I'm standing beside was not his original grave. His body rested at Bevan for the first 18 months and was later relocated to the site where you now find it. And you can tell from the reports, make some grim reading. Each of these Mosquitoes had a crew of 2, and the bodies were badly burnt and mangled, and they probably had a lot of difficulty differentiating the human remains belonged to which body. So they took the remains from each plane and they buried them in a single coffin. So my uncle was buried with his pilot in a single coffin, and the other Mosquito that I mentioned from the painting, which was shot down nearby, they were buried in another single coffin right next to it. And there was a single wooden cross to mark these 2 coffins, and it said, Hier ruhen 4 unbekannte englische Flieger. So here lie 4 unknown English airmen or flyers. And the report on the left, which I was lucky enough to be able to locate, is the report from the Missing Research and Inquiry Service for my uncle's body. And again, it makes grim reading. I actually found it quite upsetting the first time I read it. But you can see here just how badly burnt the remains must have been. Height, impossible to state. Oh yeah, exhumation report. Description of body. Height, impossible to state. Build, impossible to state. Hair, black, straight, long. Well, longish. Well, that certainly matches my uncle. You see teeth. They didn't have samples of teeth they could take. And the clothing report. No tunic, trousers. Well, the remainder of BD trousers. No shirt. Underwear or remains of pants. No sweater, no socks, no boots, nothing else. I mean, different reports have different little details, but it was very clear that it was just, well, the remains were badly damaged when they were buried. And then this part especially brings it out. Equipment that was included in the coffin. Part of a rubber dinghy, number on pump handle 270/283, webbing, escape satchels, blah, blah, blah. Clearly the Germans were scooping up what they could and putting it in the coffin, and, well, scooped up bits that, weren't human remains. And cross shows 4 unknown English airmen, cemetery record, communal grave, Bevan Civil Cemetery. I'll make another episode all about exactly where it is and how there's actually some details online that are quite wrong, because there are actually 2 villages in North Germany called Bevan, and there's one website in particular that has the wrong Bevan listed for where they died. That confused me for quite a while. I'll probably make an episode about that in future. Remarks. Trunk of body burnt. Found in coffin number 2 with another body number 2. And that's not an awful lot to ID it as my uncle, but I do agree with it, and some of it you need to look at the exhumation report for the other body that was in the coffin, who, well, there are clues on that, and again, that will be future episodes. This is just my introduction for my 3rd obsession. My first obsession is my grandfather from New Zealand, who was in the New Zealand Expeditionary Force 14 to 19. My second is William Francis, who was killed in the German Spring Offensive in 1918. And this is my third, my uncle, who was a pilot with the RAF in a navigator with the RAF in World War II. And then date exhumed the 2nd of October 1946, exhumation done by 81 GCU, RAF officer witnessing Flight Lieutenant Bernstein. Now, I've tried to identify this fellow. It doesn't help that in different forms his name is spelt in 4 different ways. I kid you not. I found 4 variants of the spelling of his name, all referring to the guy who was in charge of this. So that certainly doesn't help identify him. But you can see he had been a member of aircrew. And in fact, a lot of the crew from World War II who didn't go home immediately. They actually went and got jobs with Missing Research Inquiry Service to find their fellows who had died. And there's a whole story behind that, because of course some of it was behind Soviet lines, so they wanted to do their duty behind there, and that led to all sort of Cold War tension and all the rest. That's a whole story in its own right. Now, the day he died, we're working backwards here, was Operation Clarion, February 22nd, 1945. And as I've already mentioned, they were attacking German railways. And so I found this Cranston Fine Arts picture of some mosquitoes going after some German railroads. And I was fortunate enough to find online some accounts of a pilot who was in 487 Squadron, the same squadron as my uncle, talking about that very day. Now, Wing Commander Baker, this is quoting Cubone, Wing Commander Baker chose commissioned pilots for 487's contribution. Now, he never mentions my uncle, but when my uncle joined the squadron, he did so with Wing Commander Reginald Baker. So Baker was the pilot, my uncle was the navigator, and these two-men crew from Mosquito. So whatever Baker's doing, my uncle is sitting just behind his right-hand shoulder, at least when they're in the aircraft. Wing Commander Baker chose commissioned pilots for 487's contribution. Leading the squadron, he insisted on taking them in at 3,000 feet, despite being warned by his flight commanders that this was suicidal in daylight. And Baker and his box of 4 were shot down almost as soon as they crossed the bomb line. Had I been commissioned, I might well have been in Baker's box. Quirks of fate that can govern life or death. And sometimes in my research, you read something that's like somebody's just punched you over the heart. And that one had that effect on me, because the quirks of fate that kept him out of this attack and thereby saved his life, well, the flip side of that very same coin was the quirk of fate that took my uncle into combat, from which he would never come back. So your quirks of fate that govern life or death. This quirk kept Hugh Bone alive, and the same quirk was responsible, along it seems with Wing Commander Baker, for the death of my uncle. And 487 Squadron is a very famous squadron from World War II. The first thing they're well known for is a operation called Operation Jericho. And Operation Jericho involved an attack on a Nazi prison camp in France at Amiens, and it had lots of French resistance fighters, and it was absolutely urgent to take them out. There was an Australian squadron and a New Zealand squadron, and I think the Australians were responsible for taking out the guards' barracks. The New Zealanders were responsible for basically taking out the prison walls so there could be a big breakout. Not usually talked about was there was a third squadron hovering whose job it was to kill the prisoners if the earlier two squadrons failed in their job. But the mission was successful, and there was quite a big breakout, and a lot of them got away. Now, my uncle wasn't there. He hadn't yet joined the squadron, but nevertheless, he was a veteran of the squadron and died with the squadron, but he was not there. Operation Jericho happened in February of 1944, and this is the logo I took at the Auckland War Memorial Museum of 487 Squadron. You can see it was, while many of the people flying out that were not New Zealanders, they did have a big concentration of New Zealand pilots and navigators, and you can see there's a Maori symbol, and the Maori tiki is holding a bomb, and there's their squadron motto, Ki te Mutanga, which I think is through to the end. So that was the first thing that 487 Squadron was famous for. The second thing that 487 Squadron is very famous for happened after my uncle died. It was Operation Carthage, and there's a very new movie out made by the Danes because it involved an attack on Copenhagen, and I believe the Danish title translates as something like Shadow in My Eye, but the English name it's been given is Bombardment, so completely different. And it was on Netflix last time I checked, and it shows again an attack where 487 Squadron was heavily involved, and their job was to go after the shell house where the Gestapo had their headquarters in Carthage, and much the same as they were doing at Amiens. They had to take it out because the Danish resistance was in big trouble. Lots of their operatives had been captured and were being interrogated by the Gestapo, and they had to basically blow the crap out of the Nazis, and they couldn't do it by carpet bombing Copenhagen. So when you needed, well, the kind of thing you'd use precision cruise missiles or things for these days, they used Mosquitoes, and these guys went in and they succeeded. They took it out. I've even read one dramatic account of one Norwegian resistance fighter who was being interrogated there, and when the bombs came in, the Nazis all took off and he was able to escape and eventually gain his freedom. So it, in that sense, was a brilliant success, but there was also a horrible tragedy, because one of the Mosquitoes crashed into a Catholic school and killed a bunch of school children and nuns, and then some of the follow-up planes thought that the smoke coming from there was the target and then bombed the school. So there was tragedy as well as success against the Nazis. And that was in March of 1945. Ironically, March 21st was the anniversary of when the Germans launched their spring offensive that would kill my great-uncle. That would have been Uncle Alex's uncle. But by the time Operation Carthage happened, my uncle was already dead. But, well, he still claims by association he was a veteran of the squadron, even though he was already dead by this point. Now, how do I know about him? Well, while I have the military file for him, just like I have for my grandfather, I have something else very precious. I have his RAF logbook. You can see it's actually from the Royal Canadian Air Force. There's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a moment. And initially he was called an observer, not a navigator. Again, that's something else I'll talk about in future. And it gives you a tremendous amount of information. Sometimes frustrating what it doesn't give you, but you can see here it tells you every single time he went up in a plane. It'll tell you where he was at the time. On this particular page of his logbook, you can see when he first joined 161 Squadron, and the first time he went on a short, probably just, I don't know why, there you can see on September the 15th, they only went up for 30 minutes. If it's in red, it means it's a combat operation. If it's not in red, then it's just training or moving around or doing things. And trying to decipher this can sometimes be quite difficult. And you can see other information. It tells you what they were going up in, the Stirling bomber, who was the pilot. I've already mentioned the Australian Eddy. What my uncle's role was as navigator, where they were going. You can see they're bombing Mannheim there on September the 5th. When it's 161 Squadron, however, it's top secret, because this is about supplying the French resistance, so they never write down where they're going. It's always just ops as ordered, and the numbers on the right, day or night, tells you, well, how long they were out on their combat operation. Now, why Canada? Well, again, I'll probably make an episode about this when I really get down to making more World War II episodes, because Canada was running the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. And this was a massive effort to train aircrew and get them ready for, well, the real combat in Europe. It was well away from Germany. If you're trying to train them in England, there's always a possibility of, German fighters coming in with these green novices who don't know what they're doing yet. And they had this massive program to train all of the men who were going to be needed for, the mass 1,000 bomber operations over Germany and all of the rest. And in the particular case of my uncle, he was sent to Saint-Jean in Quebec. Not that far from Montreal, as you can see, but you can also see thousands upon thousands of men were trained all around Canada for this program. And again, future episode. And this is probably going to be another future episode. One family photo, which only came into my possession quite recently, shows my uncle. He is the one at the extreme top left with the goofy smile. Because Nola, and just the one caption written on the back of the photo was, with Nola Luxford. So I had to look her up. She was a New Zealand semi-celebrity who lived in New York. And she basically set up an Anzac club where New Zealand troops who were passing through on their way to the war, crossing the Atlantic and dodging the German submarines, U-boats, etc., would pass through here, and she'd often have them over to visit and put on a good show for them. So Nola Luxford's an interesting character in her own right, and we have photographic evidence that my uncle was one of these men. And you can see that most of these guys are also New Zealanders, but you've got a variety of different guys. On the left, you've got an obvious sailor. You have some other guys. You can see most of them, though, are observers. They're almost certainly from the same training course that my uncle was involved in. And you can see a lot of them are wearing sergeant stripes. My uncle isn't, because he had been promoted to pilot officer, and I'll talk in a future episode about why he was a pilot officer after training, but other guys were sergeants and what that meant. So that's something else. When that would have been in New York just before joining a convoy to take them across to England. Yes, and you can see here later in the war, in other photos, you see him wearing a single navigator's wing. So pilots had two wings. You can see there's one fellow who's sort of short or sitting on the floor. I'm not quite sure what he's doing, but he's got the double wings. That shows he's a pilot. All the other guys have single wings. The air gunners, the engineers, the bombing officers, all the rest, they all just have a single wing. Now, early in the war, they called them observers. Later on, they dropped the title observer and started using navigator, and then they got a different wing. Now, it's interesting because I've heard and spoken with other people that often the guys would like to keep their O because it kind of marked them out as having been in a bit earlier. But in a later photo we have of my uncle, you see he's very clearly got an N there, so I guess he wanted to go with the times and get an updated wing. Now, other things that you can learn from this logbook. They often give a surprising amount of detail. So when he was at Sywell, again, you've got the dates of every flight. This is again before training, before combat, I should say, during training. You can see what time they took off. You can see who was the pilot of the plane. They haven't yet settled on individual crew, so you can see he's going up with a lot of different ones. And they have the registration number for each of these Tiger Moths they were flying. And there are people who absolutely obsess about the aircraft manufacturer de Havilland. De Havilland made Mosquitoes, de Havilland made Tiger Moths and a few other aircraft. And you can find these databases online of the fate of every single de Havilland Tiger Moth, where it was manufactured and what was its eventual fate. And so I went through and looked them up, and to my surprise, I actually found that the Tiger Moth that he went up on the 2nd of March 1943 with somebody called Sergeant Kirby is still in existence. It's at a aircraft museum in Canada. I forget which one. I'd probably make an episode about that in future as well. But N9151 is still in existence and still airworthy. Now, if I was a bit more technical, I'd be playing some Twilight Zone music at this point, because written on the side of that plane, it has a name. And that name is Eleanor. Now, okay, that doesn't seem anything special to you, but in my family, Eleanor is very significant indeed. The girl, my auntie, who was in those family photos, was called Eleanor. I have a cousin, Eleanor. Alexander Fowler, Alec Fowler, who died in the war, his grandmother was called Eleanor. William Francis, who was killed in 1918, his wife was pregnant at the time, and when that baby was born, she was called Eleanor. I've traced back my family history on my mother's side all the way back to the late 1700s. In every single generation, there was at least one Eleanor. In fact, the reason I lost the thread in the late 1700s, because I got to the point where the mother was called Eleanor, she called her daughter Eleanor, and her son married a woman called Eleanor. So we had 3 contemporary Eleanors, all with the same last name sometimes, all in close proximity to each other, and it became impossible to differentiate who was who from the documents. So in my family history, that name Eleanor, therefore, echoes down through the generations, and it's, well, it was quite strange to see that this one surviving plane that my uncle went up in 43 was, just by coincidence, was called Eleanor. I mean, surely just a coincidence. And then there's another one. Again, this will be a future episode. And sometimes I think, oh, there's things and stories I'd like to find out, and people say, oh, you'll never work that one out. My sole clue was that my mother said, I think there was a girl in Canada while he was training. I mean, literally, that's all she knew. And I thought, oh, I'll never work that one out, but I did. And I actually managed to identify even a name. She was Miss A. Nevins of Montreal. And later still, I was able to identify her as Audrey Nevins of Montreal. And when I was looking for other pictures of tiger moths, What did I find? I found another tiger moth that just happened to be called Audrey. Again, play the Twilight Zone music, or however it goes. Now, after he had finished his training and joined an operational crew and went out with 214 Squadron, the first thing they always did was, rather than send them in a mass bombing formation for their first combat operation, they sent them gardening. Now, what is gardening? Gardening is the code word for flying off the coast at low level, at low speed, and basically sowing mines in the coastal shipping off the Dutch coast and off the German coast to try to interfere with the movement of German ships. So gardening operations, and I've got a few interesting accounts of other people who went on gardening operations that I'll share in future episodes, and that's what my uncle was doing. They even called the mines vegetables. They went gardening and they planted vegetables in the coast of Germany. And of course, after that, flying with 214 Squadron with their second Altor in Umbrus, avenging in the shadows. They took part in a strategic operation. They bombed Hamburg, they bombed Berlin, they bombed Mannheim, they bombed Boulogne in northern France, and all of the rest. Always at night time, so not in daylight like this painting shows from Cranston Fine Arts, but still, a lot of people don't even realise that the short Stirling was such a major strategic bomber for the early part of the war, because everybody always knows the Lancaster, that's the one that has the split tail at the back, but the short Stirling was used extensively in 43 at least. And then I had an absolute breakthrough, the kind of breakthrough that you never expect to get when you're studying family history. I was looking around trying to find different ways to uncover my uncle's story, and on this particular occasion I was looking up that Australian pilot, Cy Eddy. I thought, since they're always flying together, if Cy Eddy's flying, then so's my uncle, so that's another avenue I could use to pursue this research project. And I'm looking around and I stumble across this single chapter on Google Books. And it's this Canadian pilot who wrote a book about his wartime experiences. His name was Murray Peden. And he talks about, just after he joins 161 Squadron, that's the one supplying the French resistance, he goes out as second dickie for his first couple of operations. Now, second dickie means a second pilot with another crew. These planes only flew with one pilot. They didn't have pilot and co-pilot. But sometimes they would take along a second pilot just to kind of show them the ropes of how things were done. Usually this was only done with green crew. But since the operations at 161, where you had to find the French resistance, drop supplies to them, was a very different kind of mission. Even though he already had combat experience, his first two operations with 161 Squadron were flying out with experienced crew. And he mentions flying out with an Australian pilot called Eddy. And I thought, no, it can't be. So I got the book and I tracked it down. And, before I go on, I also found out that Murray had written a couple of other books. After the war, he went back and he became a lawyer, a public prosecutor. I think it was in Manitoba in Canada. And he wrote this book called Hearken to the Evidence. Very different book, but I read it and quite enjoyed it. And his third book was called Fall of an Arrow, about an absolutely failed attempt to develop an air superiority fighter for the Canadian Air Force that could, on paper, have been an absolutely excellent fighter, but for bureaucratic bungling and all sorts of other things, it was a project that never happened. So it's a story of failure and frustration and bureaucratic incompetence. And Murray Peden, as I will tell you how I came to know him shortly, Murray Peden actually told me, don't read the book, it's depressing. So I've read 1,000 Shall Fall and I've read Hearken to the Evidence, but Murray himself told me not to read Fall of an Arrow, so I followed his advice. So how did I come to get in contact with him? Well, I thought, who's this Murray Peden? I started looking him up. I saw a record of him attending a Bomber Command memorial in, about the year 2000. So I said, well, he was still alive then. I had enough to know what town in Canada he was living, and I looked up the Canadian white pages online, and I found there was an M. Peden who was living there. And so I thought, well, why not? I'll give it a go. I phoned the number in Canada, and somebody answered, and I said, hello, is this Murray Peden, the Canadian World War II bomber pilot? And he said, yes, it is. Who are you? And I explained the connection to him and how my uncle had been in the same squadron with him, and indeed in the same aircraft as him for one operation, and for the next couple of years we exchanged a lot of emails until he became too old and too unwell to continue the correspondence, and I heard that he had since passed away, but he was very, very helpful in helping me understand the logbook and had many other questions. Sadly, he did not remember my uncle, but it was 70 years ago and they only ever flew together one time. But when I actually started comparing my uncle's logbook with Murray Peden's experiences, it was, again, Twilight Zone. It was creepy how much Murray was shadowing my uncle. So Fowler, that's my uncle, went for training at Sywell from February 21st to March 20th. And 5 days after my uncle arrived, Peden arrived and remained for just 3 days after my uncle left. A little bit later, my uncle went to 1657 HCU, that's Heavy Conversion Unit, where they're learning to move to the big 4-engine bombers at Stradishall. So my uncle was there from June to July. Peden arrived a little bit after he left. Peden was at the same place from August to September. So even though they weren't there, that means the things that Murray described in his book and the people he encountered many of them would have been the same people and places that my uncle would have known, but it doesn't stop there. Fowler joins 214 Squadron in July 15th, 43. Peden joins the same squadron in September. Now, Fowler gets sent on attachment across to 161 Squadron to, work supplying the French resistance. He leaves on September the 15th, so he's gone a week before Peden arrives. But Peden, 2 months later, or less than 2 months later, is sent, following again in his footsteps, to 161 Squadron. And it's on November the 10th that, comparing Peden's account and my uncle's logbook, that I can pin down the exact day that they went out together. And then Fowler gets sent back to 214 Squadron in January. Peden had actually been sent back a little earlier on November the 22nd. So again, a lot of foreshadowing. At that point, they part ways. Peden remains with 214 Squadron for the rest of the war, but they were withdrawing the short Stirlings from combat. They didn't have as high a ceiling. They couldn't fly as high as the Lancasters, and they were more of them were being shot down than other types of aircraft. And eventually, they withdrew them from combat operations, and they were used for other things. In fact, for D-Day and Operation Market Garden, they were ideal as tugs for towing in the gliders. So there were a lot of Stirlings who were involved in bringing in those airborne troops in both Operation Market Garden and D-Day. And in the case of my uncle, the short Stirlings were sent. Some of the crews were broken up, and they went to help train other crews, getting them ready, because there was a huge demand for people who could train men, because they were scaling up so rapidly that they needed men to train. So my uncle's bomber was broken up, not the plane itself. The crew was separated, and they went off to different bases for different training. And well, yeah. And 214 Squadron was actually equipped with American flying fortresses, and Peden's book describes some fascinating things there. Again, I've got probably a few episodes talking about things you would find in Peden's book. And Fowler, as I said, went to join one of these heavy conversion units, training other men on how to use the H2S air-mounted radar system. Now, what was he doing at 161 Squadron? Well, it really was the stuff of classic movies. When you see the Nazis are hunting the French resistance, so they find an isolated field somewhere. The plane comes over and they're flashing their torch. Well, Americans would call it a flashlight. Sending the code word, and if it's right, then they dump packages. There'd be pigeons, there'd be machine guns, there'd be mines, there'd be radios. Whatever the French resistance needed, they would be getting a big airdrop. And this is what my uncle was involved in. You went on your own when there was a full moon at very low altitudes. You had to find the exact pinpoint location where the resistance would be waiting in France and drop it down. And the photo on the bottom right comes from London. It's a memorial for the agents who were dropped in there from SOE. Special Operations Executive, that is. Oh, didn't seem to want to advance. Huh? There it is. Okay, now, there's this great website that I like to use called Scribble Maps. You can create your own maps, and it's really rather useful if you can do it. I've used it when going on vacation to show people where we were going to be going and, the stops we would make. But on this occasion, I used it to really help visualize my research. Now, in his logbook, it does not tell you anything about what they were doing when they were supplying the French resistance. But 50 years later, the Official Secrets Act meant that these documents were now available from the UK National Archives. So I managed to get the reports of all their operations that comes down to exact longitude and latitudes, down to the very minute of exactly where they were going. So I was able to create this interactive map. In fact, if you follow this link, you can actually follow this map. It used to be prettier, like I actually had pictures of bombers and things like this in it, but they've updated the website and some of the features I've created in my map have since vanished, sadly. But if you click on each one of these, it'll give you some details. Some of them are where they were dropping leaflets. Some of them were failed drops where they just couldn't find the guys on the ground. Others were successful. You can see the vast majority were in France. There's one that went across into Belgium. But there was the rest. Like one of these is when they were coming home, they were going low altitude over the sea and, some German flak open fire, perhaps from a ship, they thought. And I even managed to track down some of the leaflets they were dropping. So in addition to supplying the resistance, they were dropping propaganda leaflets and all of the rest. And this is where they were going. And again, there's plenty to be done about future episodes about that. Now, this H2S Radar system that he was an instructor for most of 1944 was really quite astonishing. I don't know about you, but before I started researching this, I always used to think that World War II was much like World War I in terms of the RAF. It was machine guns, it was propellers, and it was bombs, and there wasn't much else aside from that. I didn't realize just how much technology was involved. And this H2S radar system was basically ground radar that many of these bombers would carry. I mean, it wasn't very precise, but it was very good, for example, at telling the difference between water and land. So, for example, when they hammered Hamburg in Operation Gomorrah, it was very, very useful for locating the docks because you could see the major river that runs through Hamburg and you could thereby identify very clearly where these dockyards that were making a lot of the German U-boats, in fact, were operating. So for things like that, the H2S radar system could be incredibly useful. And again, future episodes about that. Now, again, another one of these family photos that I didn't know existed until a few years ago, and one of my cousins suddenly said, "Oh, do you think Jonathan would be interested in these?" And oh, yeah, I was. Well, I'd visited my uncle's graveyard in Germany, my uncle's gravestone in Germany, but I'd never seen this photo. This was what they looked like before the headstones had been put in. They just had these wooden crosses. So this is not Bevan, the original cemetery. This is after he had been disinterred and reburied at this Commonwealth War Graves. And this was his initial grave. And this was a photo sent by the military to my family so they could see how he was buried. Flight Lieutenant AJFowler, Royal New Zealand Air Force. Died 22nd of February 1945. And, well, I spent quite a long time at that graveyard. His pilot is the next gravestone to the right that you can just make out in this photo. There's R. Baker. The other two members of the two crew of the Mosquito that were shot down near him are the two gravestones just to the left. And I spent quite a long time wandering around this graveyard, looking at many of the other gravestones as well. And many of the men who lie there were killed very late in the war. Well, like my uncle here, 22nd of February 45, almost made it through. I have to say I was very impressed with how well tended the cemetery is. You can see there's beautiful flowers, the grass is well maintained. It's well, as far as things can go, it's a beautiful cemetery. Now, that's all I have for you today, almost. And normally I would finish just by saying good evening and that would be the end. But I want to actually finish with something slightly different. I just want to highlight something from the gravestone, just how young these men were. Whenever you watch these movies, they always cast actors, and most of the time they're in their 30s or possibly their 40s, and sometimes the senior officers were. But even Wing Commander Baker, if I remember right, he was only 28, and my uncle, who had extensive wartime experience, he was only 22. That just seems so young to me now. And, well, in theory, he could still have been alive today. Like, I knew my other two uncles quite well. They've all passed now. My mother is the only one of that generation still alive in that family, but I knew them all except Uncle Alec. And sad to say, my mother was only 3 years old when Uncle Alec went to war, and she doesn't remember him going. She doesn't even remember what he looked like. She does remember when the news came that he was missing. She was about 7 or 8 years by then. But this is the tragedy of war. Some of these men are so young, and they don't get to go home. They don't get to have a future. All of that story that all the other people had, Uncle Alec did not get to have. So this is another one of my obsessions, and you will in future see some of these World War II stories, but this is the first of my World War II stories. And that's all I have for you today.